Welcome back to my list of the top 10 retired steam excursion stars. We're down to our final 2 entries, so to see what locomotives get crowned the top 2 spots on this list, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Number 2, all 4 Reading 484 T1s. Beginning in 1945, the Reading Railroad Company began converting their 280s into much more powerful 484s, a class they called T1. These mighty locomotives were the backbone of the majority of the Reading's freight operations for a while. However, when diesels began to take over, more and more people began to appreciate and become fascinated by steam locomotives. The Reading responded to this sudden fascination for steam locomotives by preserving 4 Reading T1s, 2100, 2101, 2102, and 2124. They entered the locomotives in excursion service in 1959 and operated the Iron Horse Rambles for the next 5 years. 2100, 2102, and 2124 were the stars of the show, and 2101 was kept as a backup engine but never run. These excursions are often credited for igniting a new generation's interest in railroad preservation. Reading 2124 is known for operating the first Iron Horse Rambles excursion. The locomotive operated the Rambles until 1962, when its fluid time expired. The locomotive was then bought by F. Nelson Blount for his Steamtown USA collection, similar to Nickel Plate 759 mentioned earlier. Today, it's still part of the Steamtown collection at Steamtown National Historic Site, now owned by the National Park Service. Unlike 2124, Reading 2102 has been in service almost all its life. 2 years after the Rambles ended in 1964, 2102 was sold to Steam Tours of Akron, Ohio, and spent the next 23 years running excursion and fan trips in the Mid-Atlantic, Northeast, and Midwest. In 1985, the locomotive was moved to Reading, Pennsylvania by the Reading Company Technical and Historical Society for use on their Reading Rambles. The locomotive was later purchased by Andy Muller for his Blue Mountain and Reading Tourist Railroad, where it ran until 1991, when its fluid time expired. In 1995, it was sent to Steamtown National Historic Site for a restoration which never happened. Two years later, it was sent back to Port Clinton, Pennsylvania, and placed into storage. It remained there until 2016, occasionally being brought out on display. On January 21st, 2016, however, the Reading Blue Mountain and Northern Railroad announced that the locomotive would be restored back to running condition in mid-2017, but as of this recording, that restoration has still not been completed. Reading 2101 was very popular in excursion service after the Rambles. In September 1967, 2101 and its sister locomotive, 2100, were sold to Straggle Equipment and Supply of Baltimore, Maryland. They both spent almost a decade in the firm's scrapyard until they were purchased in 1975 by Ross Rowland for use in his upcoming American Freedom Train. Using 2100 as a source of spare parts, the locomotive was restored back to running condition in just 30 days and emerged as American Freedom Train No. 1. It then pulled the eastern half of the American Freedom Train from 1975 to 1976, with Southern Pacific 4449 pulling the western half. After the Freedom Train, it was given back its original number and pulled excursions as the Chessie Steam Special to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. After the Steam Special, it was stored in a roundhouse in Silver Grove, Kentucky. Unfortunately, in 1979, that roundhouse caught fire, and 2101 was seriously damaged. In the end, Roland made a deal with the Chessie system to trade 2101 for Chesapeake and Ohio 614 at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum, and 2101 was cosmetically restored as American Freedom Train No. 1 and put on display at the B&O Museum, where it resides today. 2100 wasn't as lucky as the other three. Overall, the engine spent more time in storage or being transported than it did in operation. Like I mentioned before, this locomotive and 2101 were both sold to the same scrapyard until Ross Rowland intervened and bought both for his American Freedom Train. 2100 was a source of spare parts for 2101 and helped her become operable in just 30 days. After the roundhouse fire 2101 was involved in, 2100 was stored in a former Western Maryland roundhouse until 1988, when it was bought by the owner of Lionel Trains at that time, Richard Kuhn, and restored to running condition. Over the next several years, the ownership of the locomotive changed hands numerous times until it was bought in an auction by Thomas Paine. Now, Thomas Paine is often looked down upon and credited by many, including myself, with ruining the locomotive's heritage. Paine painted the 2100 up in a really bad scheme, lettering the tender with Feroicus. He also converted the locomotives to burn oil, which ruined the heritage. Reading T1s never burned oil. But as if that wasn't enough, he also did it incorrectly, which severely weakened the locomotive's performance and made the whistle sound horrible. Paine planned to use the locomotive to pull excursions through the Rocky Mountains, but these plans never worked out, and the locomotive was moved to Tacoma, Washington in 2007. Until 2008, 2100 struggled to pull the Tacoma Sightseer excursions on the Golden Pacific Railroad. After the sightseer excursions, 2100 was stored outside in a dry climate on a siding where it was maintained very little, if at all. It sat there for 7 years, slowly deteriorating. Fortunately, all hope is not lost for 2100. In 2015, a group known as the American Steam Railroad launched a new project called Fire Up 2100 with the goal of restoring the locomotive to running condition. In mid-2015, the locomotive was moved to a former Baltimore and Ohio roundhouse in the flats of Cleveland, Ohio. It is currently being restored to running condition, and plans include returning it back to original Reading livery and converting it back to burning coal. Hopefully, we will see a T1 back under its own power very soon. And now for the moment you've all been waiting for. It's time to crown my number one pick. Number 1, Norfolk and Western Class A, number 1218. The most powerful steam locomotives to ever operate in the preservation era, at the time of this recording, this mighty 2664 articulated was built in Norfolk and Western's own Roanoke shops in June 1943. Now, before I get into 1218's story, I'll demonstrate just how powerful these Norfolk and Western Class A's were. Using 1218 as an example, these locomotives were shorter and less numerous than Union Pacific's 4664 Challengers. Using 3985 as an example, she can generate up to 97,350 pounds of tractive effort, which is definitely impressive. The 1218, however, can generate up to 126,000 pounds of tractive effort, which outperforms 3985 by a long shot. Getting back on track with 1218's story, she and the other 42 Class A's performed very well in service until their retirement in July of 1959. All of the Class A's were originally destined for the scrapper's torch, but 1218 was the lucky one, being bought by Union Carbide Company of Charleston, West Virginia, to be used as a stationary boiler. After all 42 of 1218's sisters were cut up, 1218 took the term of sole survivor to new heights, being the only locomotive of a 2664 wheel arrangement left in the world. In 1965, the 1218 was bought again by F. Nelson Blount for a Steamtown USA collection in Bellows Falls, Vermont. 3 years later, its original owner, Norfolk and Western, did a cosmetic restoration of the 1218 in their Roanoke shops, the same place it was built, and then put back on display at Wasena Park another 3 years later. Norfolk and Western merged with the Southern Railway in 1982 to create Norfolk Southern, and their joint steam program began using Norfolk and Western J-Class number 611. As this program began to grow in popularity, it was quickly realized that the steam program required a more powerful locomotive. So on May 10, 1985, two NS diesels towed the 1218 out of the park and took her to NS's Irondale, Alabama shops to be restored to running condition, the same place that C&O Kanawha 2716 was brought back to life, like I mentioned earlier. In 1987, 1218 moved under her own power for the first time in 28 years, and ran alongside Southern 4501, Norfolk and Western 611, Nickel Plate 587, and others in Norfolk Southern's steam program. Unfortunately, 1218's excursion career wasn't to last for long. 1218's final run came at the end of the 1991 steam season, after which it was sent back to Irondale for an extensive overhaul, with the hopes of having the locomotive operational again for the 1996 operating season, but unfortunately, this wasn't to be. After the deaths of William and Robert Claytor, the two men responsible for 1218's return to steam and the Norfolk Southern steam program, much unwanted change came to the program during the 1994 season. Major restraints were placed on the steam locomotives involved, limiting where and when they could run. On top of that, yearly insurance costs soared from $10 million in '93 to $25 million in '94, with another increase expected in the next year. On top of all those problems, a switching accident in the yard in Lynchburg, Virginia, the morning of September 28th, caused the derailing and damage of 9 steam program passenger cars, 2 of which were deemed unrepairable. That pushed it to the point where Norfolk Southern found their steam program a loss. And so, in December of 1994, Norfolk Southern closed their steam program. In 1996, the 1218 was put together again and placed into storage in the Norfolk Southern's East End shops in Roanoke. In 2001, the 1218 was donated to the city of Roanoke and put on display with Norfolk and Western 611, also used in the steam program, at the Virginia Museum of Transportation, just blocks away from where they were first built. Fortunately, from 2011 to 2016, Norfolk Southern brought back their steam program under the name 21st Century Steam. This program featured Southern 4501, Nickel Plate 765, and others. In fact, Norfolk and Western 611, a star in NS's previous steam program, was restored back to running condition to participate in the program in 2015, officially being named Spirit of Roanoke. But 1218 might not be as lucky. She looks great on the outside, but as it turns out, a lot of parts are missing. Restoration would definitely be a considerable undertaking. For now, it is very unlikely that the last Class A will ever see steam again, but she still stands as a proud monument to the people who built her, the people who brought her back to steam several years later, and all of her fallen siblings. The 1218's way of taking the term sole survivor to new heights, meaning the last locomotive of a particular wheel arrangement, and being the most powerful locomotive to ever operate in the preservation era at the time of this recording, made her an easy choice for my number 1 pick on my list of the top 10 retired steam excursion stars. This has been my list of the top 10 retired steam excursion stars. Thanks for watching Pennsy Productions, and I'll see you next time.